Thank you, Isabel, and a very warm welcome to everybody. My name is Jackie Thoms, and I'm the co-founder of an organisation called Friendy that I set up over the last 18 months, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. This session is about how do we influence our internal narratives, and we're taking a very specific lens of looking into adult development and how does that help us influence our internal narratives, and how can we start to shift them, and what's important to us around that. And within the sphere of adult development, we're going to focus on one particular model as well, which is Otto Laska's cognitive development framework, which he developed while he was a researcher at Harvard. And one of the unique things that he has done is really brought awareness to the fact that we can pay attention to the structure of our thinking. So not just the content of what we're saying and the words, but actually the form and the shapes in which our words are landing in. And this is a potential path for us to start to see where do we need to shift to if we want to start changing our narratives, and not just doing it in a sort of blind fashion without really understanding what some of the direction might be around that. But we're not trying to define like what narratives people adopt, but to use this framework in a way that people can start to perceive more of the world or perceive the world differently. And this gives us some tools and ways of doing that. And when we start to shift our epistemology or the ways that we know the world, we get to stages where we start to take truth as a less sort of concrete, static aspect of life. We might start to differentiate our perceptions more, and we can hold broader responsibilities. So although I'm looking at a cognitive framework, it's very much a mind, body, and heart shift in our perception. And that ties into how we start to develop and shift our narratives. So over the 90 minutes of today's session, I thought I'll touch a little bit on Friendy, just to give you some context of what I'm doing and what we're doing with this work. And I'll share Otto Lasky's adult development framework. It's a vast body of work, so I'll be just touching into things, but hopefully it will be enough to give you some insight. And then we'll engage in some small group conversations using the framework as a basis, and then hear back from the groups before we close. So I'd love to hear from all of you and just get a sense of what brings you to this call. So I was going to pass over to Isabel. Just go around and hear the group.
Yes, everybody, and welcome. So I'm just quickly will introduce myself actually. So I'm Isabel Nessie. I work with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and am constantly trying to figure out ways to engage our WEAll citizens audience and anyone actually interested in a well-being economy. So this is the second part of a narrative series that we're running. Really grateful that Jackie's here doing this with us today. And we have another one in December. And then we had one last month with Rena, who's on the call here. So if you ever have any ideas, please feel free to reach out. I'll put my email in the chat. But yeah, so it would be great to hear from all of you what your name is and what the motivation is for why you're here. You can do that in the chat, or you could put your video on or not video on, audio, and tell all of us live here. And I can call on people.
I'm happy to start if that's all right.
Please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Maria Pavia. The reason I'm here is that well-being has been something I've...
Oh, sorry, I accidentally just hit the mute button. I'm so sorry. I meant to mute myself. So sorry.
Hello, I'm back. So I'm Maria Pavia. I've been working in the field of wellbeing since the 1980s, actually, but I won't bore you with all of that. But in 1997, I developed a piece of software for measuring wellbeing in the workplace. And since then, you know, can't get arrested, basically, because nobody's been interested in workplace wellbeing until now. They're beginning to now. So I'm an occupational psychologist and biologist. So I'm interested in the neuroscience. That's kind of my background. And I'm here because I just want to do everything possible to bring any ideas, particularly around narrative, because I do a lot of work on neurostories and the power of story. Anything that I can learn to bring to my mission to bring well-being through the workplace. So I'm interested in the well-being economy, but most of what I'm doing is talking to public sector organizations, conference speaking and things like that with larger organizations, and I'm aiming to try to get them involved in this Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the overall idea of well-being. So that's, sorry, I could go on a bit there, couldn't I? That's enough from me. Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Anyone else want to introduce themselves and share with us why you're here today?
I'd like to.
Sure.
My name's Brian McConnell. I'm joining the conference from Roanoke, Virginia. My motivation is really one of interest in the subject matter of narratives in general. I come from a pretty strong psych background, primarily as a consciousness practitioner. The idea of meaning making is something that is of central interest to me, and kind of the work that I'm doing, primarily grounded in small group practice that would entail moderating dialogue that involving really social change and the prospects of social change along the lines of collaboration. And for some pretty good size, the work that I'm doing kind of is aspiring to regional eco-regional work. So, and bearing some responsibility for moderating the small group dialogue around all that. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. Let's go to one more person that wants to introduce themselves. And thank you, Elaine, for using the chat as a function. I encourage everybody to put yourself in there at some point too. Go ahead. I'm not seeing your name. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Hilary Jeune, and I'm based in Jersey in the Channel Islands. I'm a consultant, like working on scrutinizing policies, influencing policies of multilateral organizations like the EU and World Bank. So very different from what we're here today. But at the same time here in Jersey, we're in a place where it's very, it's an island of two faces. It's extreme wealth here. I don't know if you've all heard about Jersey as a tax haven, supposedly, and then also there is a lot of inequality here as well. And I'm hoping to launch together with others kind of a process called Change Makers, where we start to look at Jersey as an alternative narrative and try to kind of gain back some kind of autonomy from that narrative that is both globally around Jersey, but also internally about that wealth, the wealth versus those that the haves and have-nots. And so I'm wanting to hear a bit more to try to help that change that narrative, because obviously there is big differences in Jersey, and we really need to work out how to come together and how to kind of move forward. And so I'm just trying to learn lots of different things. I'm also doing the art of hosting in a few weeks' time, training as well. So I really am just trying to gather as much as I can so that we can really help move this community forward and kind of heal from that issue of that big inequality gaps within the community. Thanks.
That's amazing. And I think you're really going to enjoy the presentation today. Yeah, so Jackie, why don't you carry on then? And thank you everybody for being here.
Lovely, thanks everybody. It's nice just to get a flavour of who's in the room, and welcome to the others who are not quite, haven't spoken. I'll just say a little bit about Friendly. We set up the organisation, we finally found a name. It's so difficult to find a name for what you want to call your company. So one up that one, thanks Isabel. And it's a Norse name for kinship. And we work with senior leaders across organizations and political organizations and societal organizations. And we wanted to walk alongside leaders as they're going through transition times. And at the essence of Friendly is the sense of really deep kinship. You know, how can we show up and support ourselves and each other? And we also really try to walk our talk. So there's 3 threads of our work. One is this adult development space and the developmental assessments, and we very much take that practice within ourselves. So we assess ourselves and we are very committed to our own individual and collective development. We work with leadership teams and use the frameworks with leaderships individually and collectively in teamwork. We have collective strategy making processes that are very cover everything that an organization needs to cover, but in a very collective way. And also we have established our own culture mapping and measurement process. So those are some of the threads. And we're trying to bring our leading edge practices into our work, because so many people in these roles, like as a consultant with organizations, do really different practices like systemic constellations or warm data or this adult development field. And part of what we're doing is bringing that into the client space. And that feels edgy at times and exciting. And one last aspect of Friendly that I felt was important to share within the sort of well-being economy conversation, we are currently establishing our own complementary currency within Friendly so that we can reduce our reliance on the banking system. So when we want to make payments to each other, or if we want to bring somebody in either as a supplier or to do training or to consult us, we have this currency that's really allowing us to do this barter system. And it's meaning that our exchanges are really embedded in relationship, and we're living and experience a much more interdependent sense of what it is to be colleagues and walk alongside in this deep kinship. So we're learning a lot around that, and there's a lot more to go, but that's a little flavor of Friendly. So if we could move on, I'd like to start by beginning to talk about this vast topic of adult development and just giving you a slice of some aspects of it. So childhood development is much more well known. We know the names of some of the leads like Piaget, and it's also so much more visible because it's so fast and happening, and you can almost see children developing day to day in front of your eyes. But when it comes to adult development, it's not as well known. It is much less visible, and it's slower because it happens over a lifetime. However, there has been about 40 years worth of research into adult development, and there's a number of models like Bill Torbert, Suzanne Cook-Reuter, Robert Keegan. Some of those of you interested in these know those names. And so there is actually a huge body of work, and it's just beginning to come in a little bit more from the fringes. And that's something that I'm excited about and hope that Friendly can contribute to. So this is taking Otto Laska's work, as I said, and he's highlighted 3 core aspects of adult development, but fully acknowledging that there may be many more, and over time we'll keep adding to this. The first one on the left is the cognitive aspect, where we're looking at how to develop cognition, how to develop the mind. The middle one is the social emotional aspect, where we're looking at how to develop maturity and wisdom and the capacity to take decisions. And then the third aspect is the psychological thread and worldviews and state and so on, which Maria, you may be able to speak more to than me, but that would be welcome. And Laska's model is very much concerned with the social emotional thread and the cognitive thread. So I'd like to just start by saying that talking through the social emotional aspect, just giving you a highlight of that. So over a lifetime, a person can develop through different stages where they can become more mature or more responsible. And very often it's crises that lead us into these moments where we are more aware of our development, where we might have been trying a certain approach to some challenging situation and nothing that we've tried before has worked. So we are being pushed or stretched to try something different. And we're willing to take more of a risk in those situations. And that's often when we are more aware, I'm growing, I'm developing, I'm trying something new. Interestingly, recently, we're seeing that on a much more societal scale with coronavirus, where certainly in the Western world, that sense of our health being our responsibility, our individual, we can control it within our own sphere, is really being challenged as we're starting to see the interdependencies of health from, you know, many different countries across the world. So our health is now dependent on our neighbor in the street next to us, as it is in the supermarket on the high street, as it is in another country across the world. So that's starting to shift our perceptions as well. And the other one that has been so powerful has been the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's really helping us to acknowledge systemic patterns and systemic issues, which again is not being so common. So all of these things are helping us shift how we perceive the world. And these are very important factors for how we start to shift our own narratives. So I will go through a whistle-top tour of the 4 stages above S1. S1 is for children and their developmental stage. Sorry, I use my hands too much and Isabel thinks I'm asking her to move slides. I'll try and sit in them for a moment. So S2 is where people are moving out of childhood into teenager years. So it's somewhere between 14 to 25. And for anybody that's connected with teenagers, you'll know that the world is very much fulfilling them. They are quite manipulative in how they approach the world. And I've got a 15-year-old daughter who never texts me when she goes out or is going to be late. Eventually, after much request, she started to text, but initially it was just to make sure that she would get to go out next week. You know, it wasn't so much to meet my needs as to still meet her needs, which is very S2. But I would say there are little glimpses coming through from her of moving beyond S2 and starting to open up into S3, where actually she's beginning to text when she's late because she knows that I'll be worrying about her. And that's when we go on the journey to start to include other people in our worlds and in our meaning making and in our decision making. It could be said that somebody like Trump or Donald Trump is stuck in that S2 space. And I wouldn't comment on the psychological aspects because that's definitely not something I can, but I have worked in organizations where leaders have been cognitively very, very developed, but have been at a low level development of social emotional capacity. And that can be a very destructive balance because they have a lot of desire for power and a lot of influence, but are not necessarily willing to go beyond self in terms of what they're considering, how they're meaning making in the world. So moving out of S2, we head into S3, where it's so much more about how we are playing the rules of the game according to other people. So we're including other much more in our meaning making. And our internal narratives are much more aligned to the mainstream culture, either of the society that we live in or the organization that we work for or our families or our friends. And most of society, 50 to 60% of society has been measured to be in this S3 space. And this is really important for when we're wanting to look at how do we influence narratives, because the S3 is really about belonging and how do I make meaning within this group and within this community. After a while, when people might be interested in learning or searching a little bit further, it may get to a point where actually the community that I'm involved in, the values and the principles just don't align as much as I would like them to. I'm starting to see the differences and the cracks, and I can't fully 100% see that those values and principles are mine. And at that point, we start off on a path away from S3, which can feel very risky on a sort of existential level, because we can be leaving behind the comfort of our family of origin, or maybe we choose to leave a job, or we might even go as far as changing relationships or countries. And so these paths happen, but there is quite a sense of risk involved. So leaving the S3 space and moving towards S4 can feel risky, and so can most of the stages through this. And then S4 is more around where we're really starting to embody the values that we hold dear and the principles that we want to lead our lives by. And that can be a very, come across as somebody who's very grounded and strong in their opinions. Sometimes it can feel very strong and a little bit overbearing. But for people leading organizations, that S4 stage is a really sort of foundational place to be for them, and to be able to be mature enough to hold a bigger picture, to be aligned enough within themselves, and to be able to make wider decisions. And then beyond S4, it's where people are starting to be in a very fluid sense of meaning making in the world, and their viewpoint might be changing as they consider another person's perspective. And that can move quite radically. They can really have a sense of experiencing other and including that within many, many perspectives that they hold. And no one perspective is particularly dominant. So there's sometimes that sort of alchemical sense of somebody moving towards the more mature stages, and they can hold a very broad view of life. So that is a very, very fast talk through. Are there any questions? Or any thoughts or reflections at this point? I'll move on to the cognitive in a moment, but I'll pause just for a second. Thank you. Brian, were you wanting to ask something?
Yes, Jackie. I'm wondering whether, from your perspective or in the framework of Otto Lesky's efforts and work, whether there's a distinction between, with regard to consciousness, between the cognitive and more ontological states of being.
Yeah. So I
don't know if that.
Yeah, I think that within the sort of beyond S4 state, you're really in that more being and flow state at times, or more of the time. And so your relationship to other is taking up, you're more and more objective, basically. And so when things are happening to you, you're not responding quite as reactively. And so you're much more in that sort of open consciousness space. And very often people who are in the later stages of that social emotional development also have a very agile cognitive capacity. The two go hand in hand. And so there's just a fascination with life. And there's a sense that through this model that we're actually getting closer to reality rather than actuality. Of course, we never can close that gap fully. But part of the beauty of this model that I experience is this lovely sense of opening and experiencing differently. And I've done many of the different profiling things through my coaching. I find this one to be one of the more complex ones. So it does reflect back a much more complex sense of who we are, while still appreciating it's only ever a snapshot of the sort of vastness of us. I hope that speaks to your question, Brian.
Yeah, that's very nicely framed, Jackie. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So thank you for going with me. And Isabel's told me I'm rattling my papers, so I'll try to pause a little bit. And I just wanted to speak a little bit to some of the, this is a model for individuals, but you could hypothesize across sort of society and organizational life. The S2 narrative is playing a very dominant role in our society, and it's really holding that competition takes priority, as we know, and we see that being played out in so many areas of our life. But it doesn't really play the interdependence of things or the interconnectedness enough of nature and of life. And that is actually creating us to not really hold ourselves in the fullness or the capacity of who we are as human beings. We're in a way perceiving society as if we're individuals that have this sort of brutal neoclassical narrative that's come from the 1800s, and that our narrative implies that we as humans just take anything from anywhere unless someone stronger holds us back. And it's not that that's not true, but it is limited, and it doesn't really speak to the fullness of what is possible. And it's similar for the climate change narrative, the sense that we need our governments to hold us back, or that we are evil or we're parasites on the earth. And again, not that it's not true, but we are ignoring and limiting our capacities to be different by making this narrative so dominant. Just went on silent to rustle my papers. So with a developmental view of who we are as humans, we've a much greater capacity to shift our stories through these different levels and different stages. And we really need multiple descriptions and multiple stories that highlight both the problems, but also the possibilities and the paths forward. So we're needing to be in a more complex sense of what are our narratives, and how can we keep bringing the newness into our narratives. And I think we're seeing that we're in sort of change maker spaces. People are really starting to show up and bring their own narratives into those spaces. So if we want to shift the inner framework, that is how we're going to start to actually shift some of the outer framework and the outer narratives. So I'm going to move on now to the cognitive capacity, which is the left-hand face, and just give a little bit of background on that. I said already that this is what supports us to move into a much wider scope of responsibility. So we can have more of the world guiding our decision making, and we have more capacity for much wider decisions. And we see that with really transformational leaders. They're usually cognitively very agile and holding so many different systems and perspectives and thoughts, and in a moving sense of the world, which gives us a sense of that wonderful cognitive capacity. So there are 4 moments of cognitive capacity, and I'll move on to the next slide just to talk you through them. So this work came from, actually, can I go up just one slide again, Isabel? Up, down, yeah, there. I just wanted to say that traditionally, dialectical thinking was thought of as the capacity to hold 2 things or 2 polarities together. And I wanted to mention Roy Basker, who was a British philosopher who identified these 4 moments and started to develop the sense of dialectical thinking, which is where somebody can use all 4 of these different thought forms and thought moments in their thinking. And so that Otto Lasker took that work and brought it into his framework. So that was the thing I wanted to mention. So if we go on to the next slide, Isabel. there are 4 different dialectical moments. Okay, so it's where we're starting to see more complexity in our thinking. And I'll start with context, which is where we are perceiving our world as being very structured and ordered. We see the hierarchies, we see the parts and the wholes, and there's a rather stable and static view of the world. And context thought forms can be extremely useful as anchors so that we know what each person, what we're talking about and can orientate around a subject. Lawyers are often very good in contextual thought forms because they need to paint pictures and go into great detail. And most of adults this is a dominant use of thought forms in society, is our contextual thought forms. And that in itself could be one of the contributions to why status quo seems so difficult to change. Because if people are in these more static and stable thought forms, it's difficult for people to perceive into the more moving and changing worlds that we're living in. And then if we move into process thought forms, these are where we live and see that change is constant, and conflicts are tensions where maybe the new and the old come together, and that movement in itself can be included and can be valued. There's a sense of understanding and seeing what's not visible and trying to include that. So for example, if we're very strong as a society, Western societies, certainly in contextual thought forms, and we see things as very stable, it's been hard for us to really accept climate change. And I mean, there's many different variables in that. And, there's been a lot of power and influence on what we've been fed in the news and what we've been influenced to believe in our narratives. But if people are strong in process thought forms, then they're constantly looking for what to include and what's not visible, but still influencing. And I'll move on to relational thought forms, which is where we are really looking at what is the common ground between all these different elements or these different factors. And at first glance, we don't always see the relationships, but on sitting with a topic or getting to know an area better or an organizational system, then we start to see the relations and what is causing and influencing and weaving into each other that we didn't see initially. And this is not a common thought form moment. We're not really being taught through our educational systems and societal systems to think in this relational way. But it's very fundamental for us to start to think in more systemic ways. And that feels really needed right now, because a lot of our education and what's informing us and what we can perceive and what narratives we can hold is much more reductionist. And with a use of the 3 thought form moments of context, process, and relational, if there's good and diverse use of those moments, it leads us into transformational thinking. And this is really about systems in transformation. So an organization or a society or a community or even a body with the microbiome and all the complexity of our human bodies. And whole thoughts are held in a mind of context, process, and relational. And we can see connections coming together. We can observe the movement in a system. We might be looking at where is a system getting to its limits, and needing to break into something new and develop. Or we might be seeing that this system is in transformation. Everything is changing, and yet the identity is still the same, and there's a core connectedness that points to the essence of life. So, an example might be looking at all the crises that we're living through now is actually really the transformation of our society from this materialistic and exploitative processes into something that is much more well-being much more aligned with nature, and that we are living through these processes, but we're still sustaining our identity, even though at times it can feel particularly unstable. Would anybody like to ask anything? There's a lot to take in there, but what makes sense and what feels confusing?
If no one else is jumping in, I mean, I don't think it's confusing. It makes a hell of a lot of sense. I'm studying at the moment, looking at the educational processes, educational policy, etc. You know, and this is precisely the kind of transformation, the paradigm shift. Looking at what that actually will look like and can look like, and once we detach our current systems of education away from the economic growth model, and the journey we need to take. And I think, you know, this is it's sort of the grand narrative, if you like. So we're talking about our own kind of narratives, but we're stuck in this in many cultures in this consumerist and extractivist narrative. So I think that I mean, this links to me to the ULab kind of stuff, but it also seems to be perhaps a bit deeper. Maybe there's complementary elements to it, but I think how we make this kind of language and this way of thinking more accessible and more mainstream is a hugely important part of our movement.
I appreciate your words so much, Mark, because I delve into this work and I more and more see that until we create scaffolding in our systems like education and politics and, you know, agriculture and culture, you know, to support our development and as adults and to support the quality of our thinking, we will not be able to meet the crises that we're facing. And education for me is so critical to this. How do we get the profundity of this kind of thinking into schools so that they are, I believe, and I think it's true that we as children are immersed in complexity. You know, we pick up the flower and we wonder what it's hearing, you know, and we wonder what the smell of green paint is, you know, and so we're not limited, but we may not be able to sort of have that reflection and objective perceiving of the complexity, but we're totally in it. And then the schooling systems reduce that and make it very separate, and so does society. You know, we're separating everything, which is not the reality of actually who we are as humans and what our nature is and what nature is on a broader scale. So yeah, I would love if this could start to flavor and conversations and thinking in some of the bigger systems. There's a book that I want to refer to later that I don't know if you have read it, Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta. But it's about the Indigenous communities in Australia and how rich their complexity thinking is and how embedded in nature they are. And he talks about the schooling system in Europe started in Prussia in the late 1800s to grow soldiers and civil servants who would conform, who would have a sort of universality of what they thought. And this model was then quickly adopted across a lot of European countries, including the UK, the US, and Australia. And that's the foundations of the beginning of our education system. And it's not that it's all bad, but it's just an interesting aspect that it was fundamentally created to slow down our development. Wonderful. I will enjoy exploring that. Thank you. Mark just recommended the Epistemologies of the South by Boaventura de Sousa Santos. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Okay, thank you. Anything else that, any other
Jackie,
thoughts? Brian?
Jackie, I'm kind of curious about. I think that there's an important distinction between learning and education, particularly in the West, that education kind of emphasizes to some extent the institutionalization of the learning process, and historically has kind of reinforced the separation that you just referred to. So that seems to translate at this point in time, and this is kind of a reference to Zach Stein's work with education with regard to his book dealing Time Between Worlds, that the role of culture is, I think, maybe in the relational dimension, that with respect to values and shared values, belief systems, along the lines of meaning making, is something that in your reference to indigenous cultures, that's something that an indigenous culture may be more inclined to hold for itself and preserve for itself than it kind of has been in the cultures that Mark has referred to in terms of consumption and growth, kind of facilitating the process of transformation. So anything that you can add to that, I'd appreciate.
If I've understood correctly, Brian, I think that I've studied with Nora Bates on her warm data, and it's very much about understanding that whilst we might be trying to take the carbon dioxide out of the air, actually that real issue lies in our politics and in our culture and in our identity with wealth and in our educational systems. And that's the complexity that we're dealing in. It's transcontextual. Whereas we are educating our children in these more separate silos and not helping them see the sort of interdisciplinary aspects or the interdependencies that exist. And one of the things that Gregory Bates and Nora's father, he says so many things, but one of the beautiful things is he was talking about in nature that competition and interdependency are both needed and are, interplay beautifully. And we only currently seem to be able to focus so much on the competition. I see us pulling towards interdependency more. I'm just think, gosh, knowing us, will fly over that way and ignore competition. And actually, can we have the complexity of thinking to hold both, so that we are more able to be in a transformational space of how we approach these things. I hope that speaks to what you were saying, Brian.
It does, and referencing Gregory Bates, and yeah, that I totally concur with that. It totally brings it, and his younger daughter's work, Nora's work, and kind of related to that, to meaning making. I'd had some interaction in group work recently, involving meaning making and Nora Bateson's
Yeah, she's the meaning maker in residence on the STOA for the next 3 weeks, and I highly recommend her. She, for me, makes sense of what's going on when not so many other voices are. So it's really beautiful, and I've got a reference for her later in the slides. So thank you for the comments and the feedback. That's really helpful. What I wanted to do now is to take a topic. And it's just last week. So if we go on to the next slide, you'll have seen it a moment ago. And you may be a little bit tired of this in some senses, but hopefully it will be a useful topic because of the potential for us all to hold such different stories and different narratives around it. And I wanted to take a little bit of time to explore our stories around it, just so you could get a flavor of these different contexts. So what we'll do is we'll take the US election as a topic and we'll break into small groups with probably 3 or 4 people. You'll be put into a group that has one of the dialectical moments, and it'll be named that moment. So it'll either be context, process, relational, or transformation. And we'll give you sort of 10 minutes or so just to have a conversation on the following questions. If you go on a slide, Isabel, we can show the questions. So in order to make this a little easier, we have put together a Google Doc so that when you go into your breakout rooms, you can access this slide and the instructions. And we'd ask that one person in the group becomes a note taker and just captures 2 or 3 things that are sort of insights or things that were interesting from the conversation. So Isabel, I believe if you're ready, will take us into the breakout rooms in a moment. And the Google Doc link is, can we share that, Isabel, so I can get it if, yeah. Any questions before we go on what we're doing for the next 10 minutes?
I've just shared, that's the Google Doc link. And so I'm gonna just do 4 breakout rooms. Is that okay? Does that make sense? Okay.
Perfect.
Great. And let's see.
Great. So we'll head off for 10 minutes and then we'll call you back and look forward to hearing some of your thoughts. Enjoy the conversation.
Hello, welcome back.
Well, double welcome back. Okay, so I'd love just to hear a little bit from you, like how was that conversation? What are the, I think we've had some questions, I think, Isabel, on one of the slides, but maybe you could read them so that we could see each other. That would be really helpful.
Sure. All right. So I will start with process. So the questions, or no, we'll start with context. Sorry.
Actually, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So context is, what is the bigger picture that the elections have shed light on? And what, in your view, makes the US political system so resilient?
Who was in the context group?
Yeah, hi, it's Elaine. I was in the context group. I was a bit late joining, and I think some of the other participants as well had missed the start as well. So we could have used a bit longer than the 10 minutes, if I'm honest.
No
yeah, what we thought was it highlighted the inequality in the US. A lot of the people who were disfranchised and felt they were not being served by the political system. And that's led to the real division on the 2 sides. We also then talked about, from that polarisation, how there was no room for constructive discussion or dialogue in the middle ground. and a lot of people felt left out because there was a lack of opportunities to have constructive decisions. You were either, left or right, in or out.
And Elaine, can I ask you, are there new insights that you got from the group? I appreciate that coming in a little bit later might have been not so easy, but was there anyone in your group that felt that they had new insights from this conversation?
Yeah, well, I personally got some new insights, and I think Cindy as well, perhaps because Jen was actually in the States, so it was really interesting to hear from someone on the ground in the States, from Jen. And she also mentioned that Stacy Abrams, I think it was, and Jen might want to come in and say something about that. We also talked about the apathy that it caused. Moving on to the second question about the resilience of the system, sorry. We weren't really sure we had a wee debate whether it was actually resilient or not to start off with. We had some debate about that, but then we settled on the fact that there was a level of transparency. There had been a larger voter turnout than there had been historically, and everyone did understand what the process was and what the steps were. So we thought that perhaps that was keeping the sort of the feeling of democracy resilient in people's minds. Jen, wonderful. I don't know if you want to come in and mention about Stacy Abrams, if I've got the name right.
I can do just very quickly. I was just adding some context. The organisation I work for, we had a webinar with Stacy Abrams, who's a voting rights advocate, about a month ago, and the sort of vitriol we received having hosted her webinar online was impressive. But we had a lot of US citizens getting back to us to set the name of the webinar was. It was something to do with, it was called, Is Democracy Becoming a Spectator Sport? And a lot of people commented saying, well, the US isn't a democracy, it's a constitutional republic, and so democracy doesn't matter, kind of thing, which was just interesting. So that was the comment on Stacey Abrams. Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you, Jen. That's really interesting to hear. And I was thinking about a transformational thought form when I was coming into this conversation, and I was actually thinking about how much democracy is in crisis, and yet, people are really wanting to rule themselves, and yet there's so many ways in which democracy is embedded across all these different contexts of, like, our economics, our health, our agriculture. And what will democracy mean when millions of people are migrating through climate change, and how important is it going to be for us to embed ourselves in self-organizing and in political roles so that we can actually function through these shifts. So thanks, Jen, that was very topical, so to add a little bit more. Anything, yeah, carry on as well, I'll pause.
No, I was just going to go to the next question, but I think if anyone has to add to context, okay. Process is the next question. So in the election campaigns, which conflicts have been unfolding and how? What is it that we ignore about politics?
Who was in the process conversation? Don't worry if you did all four, but maybe if you want to add something, it'd be lovely to hear from you.
It might have been us. So
okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah, John and I basically try to cover everything, I think.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and then it kind of ended up as a sort of interview process, me interviewing Joe. So yeah, maybe Joe, you can come in anytime you want to come in. But I guess two things, that big thing that came was mentioned was the COVID-19. Whether to wear a mask or not, anti-masker sort of movement to, vaccination, the preventions and so on. And that also kind of made a connection with the healthcare issue that has been sort of discussed for a long time in the US. Another one is the climate change issues, where the Trump government has been more focusing on fossil fuel industry and then supporting that sort of narratives and the viewpoints, while the Biden has been much more focusing on the climate you know what I mean, like the Paris Agreement support and so on. So those are the two things that has been mentioned while we were looking at that. Did I cover everything?
Yeah. Was there anything around what is it that we ignore about politics?
Yeah, can I come in here?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, from a personal point of view, I did support one of the candidates more than the other, but I found that when I tried to find slightly more objective information about the other candidate, I found that quite difficult. I think the media tended to just tell their own story about how they wanted to portray each candidate, and to find more objective, unbiased information about each of them, I found quite difficult.
Mm. Yeah.
And then maybe to
Carry on
add
reading.
that, yeah, just because I've been also working in the media industry as well. And then this has been sort of a discussion that has been going on also in the media. Like there's a lot of, the filtering going on, and that basically choose the specific narratives or specific understanding of the certain issues. And that automatically filter out the rest. And that basically kind of facilitate those others to form their own sort of community. So that, like, I thought it was really good, Joe mentioned during that session.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And moving on into relational.
Yeah, so the questions for relational are: what unites Democrats and Republicans? And what patterns that you observe in the US context play a pivotal role in the systems you're exposed to?
Mariana and I discussed this. Mariana's walking around Paris at the moment. Really jealous. But yeah, so that was fun. Mariana, if you can, add anything that I miss out. Basically, that kind of first question, there was a little bit of discussion about if we just describe people as Republicans and Democrats, then, we're already starting to put people in boxes which really don't tell a complex story about them. It simplifies them and dehumanizes them to a great extent. But we also thought that a lot of them are capitalists on both sides, and there's also quite a lot in the States of this kind of love of nation, this connection with America and that kind of identity of being American. So that could be seen as uniting. What patterns do you observe in the US context? That Mariana made a very good point of polarization, and this kind of the role of the social media in creating a kind of echo chamber, so that we often weren't hearing different aspects and different perspectives on things. Mariana, do you want to sort of add to that?
I think that was let me open the camera. I'm masked and moving. That's why I'm not opening it. But I think that was a great summary of our discussion. Many thanks for that.
Thank you both. I appreciate what you said at the beginning, and I've heard different thought forms like through different people speaking. So, but I'll just say that there was a real critique of reductionism in the question, and that's a really important part of how we start to shift a narrative. Like, we don't need to accept the question. Like, what is a question that is actually more healthy or more valid or more complex? And so, living in the UK and having just gone through this drawn out Brexit process, I mean, that was the wrong question. That wasn't the question that we needed to answer. And yet, look at what's happened through that narrative. So I just loved the way that you fed that back. Thanks, Mark. And then on to the last group, which I was in. So Maria and Brian, who would like to say a little bit about?
Do you want me to ask questions really quickly?
Yes, that would be lovely. Yeah. Thanks.
So the first one is, how can the US elections support the development of what needs to happen globally? And what in our own thinking of a well-being economy reinforces the dominance of the existing monetary systems?
Well, that was interesting because I think we had a lot of talking about thinking and how we think about it, which is interesting. And I was just about to write in the chat actually to Jackie. That's great learning. You know, maybe the question isn't the question we should be asking. Maybe we should be asking ourselves, is this the right question? Which, so I'm just literally going to write that down, and we were called upon. So, and I think what we were talking about really was interesting. We were kind of taking a meta position on it really, and talking less about answering the question itself, but actually looking at what the question represented to us and how we were reflecting on that. So that was quite an interesting process. To an extent, we were looking at answering the question, what is the US election doing? But a lot of what we were doing, I think I would say, is asking the question or allowing the question to kind of transform into, what does all this mean to us? And how are we going to try and even think about understanding this? What are your thoughts, Brian? Is that kind of, does that kind of in a sort of way summarize it?
Yeah, I concur with that. But the audio was kind of breaking up for me. I don't know whether I'm being heard or not.
We can hear you.
I'm afraid it's, well, okay. I like that framing, Maria, about the importance of the shared inquiry in getting the tenet for that is one that I learned kind of through Buddhism, which tends to be inquiry based, is that the formation of the question itself, how the relevance in taking you a step closer to some sort of, well, the resolution of the issue or the question, you know, at hand. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you. I think that sense of being in the meta space, and there's something about when you're in such big complex questions like that, you move from the macro to the micro and back again. And but that's important, because I think in society we often make the macro more important, but the micro is just as informing of actually what really wants to and needs to be paid attention to. So thank you, Maria, for bringing that in. Lovely. So just a few moments to hear from you, like what was that process like? So we were sort of touching into different thought forms and wanting to just get a flavor of that. I'd love to hear from you how you experienced that. I'm interested actually in the group that did all 4, because that might have been a better exercise to do. So I'm learning here too.
Yeah, I think it really sort of, in a way, transformative. Like when Joe says something, and then I was like, oh yeah, that also connects to. So it was kind of the process of connecting the dots. I felt, and that was really nice. Yeah, if it was a bigger group, because we only had 2 people in the group, but if we had more people, maybe that process has been even, you know, having even more sort of wide, and yeah. So that, yeah.
Did you notice when you were going through the process, did you feel as though you were kind of going through a progressive process? So starting with context and then moving on to process. Did you notice your own thinking kind of developing as you were going along?
For me, it was. I'm not sure if it was for Joe, because I was asking that question, but for me, it was a really nice process that I could actually, oh yeah, actually that, what she said before actually is connected. So that sort of, you know, the transformative process. Yeah. Definitely.
Interesting.
Okay, so thanks, Rena, for sharing that. That was really helpful to know, and also that really is useful for me to hear. I'd like to just go through the last few slides, because some of the things that you've been saying here I can tie into other things that might be of interest to you. So I'll jump back into the slides just to cover that off before we complete. So if we go down one slide, I mentioned this book earlier, and the author Tyson Yunkaporta, and it's a really wonderful book if you want to dive in further, if you haven't already, into Indigenous thinking, and a sense of how somebody who's lived both in Australian Indigenous cultures and more modern cultures can talk to those experiences. And I love what he says: sustainable systems cannot be manufactured by individuals or appointed committees. But if you listen to many voices and stories, you can discern the deep, complex pattern that is emerging. And you can usually determine what is real and what's been airbrushed for questionable agendas or corrupted by flash mobs of narcissists.
Oh,
I know it's beautiful, but he also, he really doesn't hold back. He's quite informal. He's got a great sense of humor. And so I'd really encourage you, if you're interested, to try the book. He would hate the fact that I was quoting him like this, so I'll just warn you. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention on the next slide is, I've mentioned Nora Bates, and within Friendly, there are a number of us that have trained with her and the warm data and people need people training that she does. And this is one of her many sort of thought leading ways, is that perception is action, and a change of perception is a change of actions, and many at once. So no spreadsheet can hold the many ways in which a shift in perception shifts a whole life, and the lives of those in relation to that person and those in relation to them, and so on. And for me, what you were just speaking to, Rena, about connecting the dots and seeing different things, a warm data lab is to help us with questions like what is essential or what is happening. And then we talk about it through really big contexts like culture, like agriculture, like politics. And we start to see all the patternings across contexts and how things are interdependent, and we start to feel our connection to aspects of those and gain insights. So that's one really wonderful way to help us shift our perception and our narratives. And then I was just looking at Elaine's comment that the process felt natural to you. That's useful to know. Yeah, okay, but interesting if there'd been very opposing opinions. Thanks, Elaine. And then on the next slide, I've just referenced Otto Lasco's book, which is for the really committed follower. His literature is not easy access, but I just wanted to let you know that it exists, and he's such a wonderful thinker that it's really quite full on, but could be a bit dry. But again, he's just saying that complexity thinking and dialogues are really needed for this time of turmoil, and that formal and logical thinking is just not going to help us get on this path for transformative thinking. So are there any other questions or comments before?
I have one more, Jackie, just kind of a big, because I'm only vaguely familiar with Otto Lasky's work. This is not something that I've read. I just made a note to myself. I will, but my question has to do with the framing of dialectical thinking. How does that translate with respect to dualism, kind of as we tend to refer to it within an integral context as integral practitioners?
And can you just give me a sense of what you mean by dualism, because there's many different ways of referencing that. What's your meaning?
I think the easiest, the way to most readily frame that is with respect to states of consciousness, and what Ken Wilber has referred to as 5 states of consciousness in a spectrum of gross or concrete to subtle to causal to witnessing and on to non-dual. And so that final non-dual state,
yes,
transcending dualism as we otherwise know it.
Yeah, thank you. I get you. So that for me would be where somebody is more in the sort of S4 and beyond stage, where your relationship to, it's that subject-object relationship, and you're more in that objective space. So it's not so much in that dual consciousness, and the sense of really feeling like you're a moving, transforming being within nature, and that's your experience is I hope the words sometimes aren't enough to express some of these concepts, but I hope that gives you some sense of it. There's a much more flowing state of how we see life, and I think often if you when you meet somebody who's super mature and wise, there's an incredible calmness about them, because they're really living the preciousness of life, and it's lovely just to be with them. So that's been my experience with the one or two people that I've met in that sphere. So Maria said that she'd call that being in unity rather than being in separation. Yes, and yet the way that we bring ourselves up is in that separation space, and it's so interesting that we're really exacerbating that with the COVID and social distancing. And I know for myself just how much I'm missing that connection with people. So any other comments or thoughts or questions?
I suppose for me, it's just about how we develop from this. I mean, I'm interested in knowing more. I'm very interested in how it adds to a developing conversation. I think for me, I said it was like kind of metacognition, that kind of way of thinking about how you're thinking, and that could be something that we all uses as a process for us discussing, various types of issues within the context of the relationships we're building across the citizen group.
Yes.
So it's something about embedding this, quite often there's people like ourselves maybe, who go off and we have interested in this and we speak to each other, but how do we get out to other people who are not immediately linking in and saying, oh yeah, I'm interested in that?
Yeah.
So that's where I think because it's by bringing ideas to people that I think that's why I'm interested in, how I don't know if you're familiar with the term agnetology.
I'm not.
So agnetology is the production of ignorance. So it's the kind of opposite of epistemology.
Yeah.
And it talks about how certain knowledge is also kind of forefronted and others is hidden. And that's a lot to do with like indigenous knowledge. So we kind of sideline indigenous knowledge and we forefront this kind of West, kind of a enlightenment type of dialectic. So I think it's really important that we are coming up with processes where we can deconstruct and help people to unlearn a lot of the patterns of thought that people are put on when they're very young. You started talking about that when you talked about the child that picks up the flower, and then a lot of our schooling system de-skills them. And what Illich talks about conviviality, and moving towards that, and it's like, and again, I really love all this stuff, I'm really comfortable with it, but how do we make it more accessible and something that isn't, to an extent, when we change, we you talked about it, some people are happy with change and comfortable in that space and other people aren't. So how do we create this culture where we are actually all more comfortable with complexity and settled in uncertainty?
Yes.
But find a deeper certainty underneath that.
Well, I can't talk on I think there's so many things. I'll talk about two things that we're doing. One, we've got a project called Cadra where we're going to assess 40 political and organizational leaders and feedback their capacity, both on the social emotional scale for their being, are they wise enough and mature enough and responsible enough to be in their roles, and also on this cognitive capacity. And then we're going to ask them to make this available, and so the data available. So I feel like that if we get it right, we've got some funding from Erasmus, that could be the beginning of an interesting seed, and that those 40 leaders, if they see what we're doing, they may help us sort of become more mycelium-like in how we approach this. And the second thing we're doing next year, we're creating an online space called the Drillosphere, which is the soil in and around the earthworm, and how, just like you were saying, Mark, how do we deconstruct and how do we decompose and decompost what we need to break down and start to see things differently. And we want to run mind opener programs online and invite people into them so that we could go through like what Rena did in that small prototype. Thank you, Rena, and Joe, I think. Yeah, so those are some aspects. And then I think on a broader scale, it really, these aspects of this, or you know, if it's not this framework, whichever framework supports, but how do we get this into the education systems? And we're looking at organizations and politics, but it needs to become much more broad. So I'm really open to conversations if anybody would like to explore avenues and ways to support that. So thank you for mentioning.
In the last just minute,
yes.
Can I ask you to speak to Joe's question, which is, how can I apply the exercise we've just done to my own personal thought process? Because I think this is a really nice piece to sort of wrap on.
Beautiful. I was thinking before this call, but I didn't have time to do it, that I would create a one-pager of questions across each of the thought forms and just and send it to you through Isabel so you can have it. And thanks, Mariana. And also, we could also meet as a group and call other people and go through a question and just reflect on it over a week and notice how it starts to shift our thought patterns and then come together again. There's so many things that I'm open to. So I'll send the one pager tomorrow to Isabel. And then if anybody wants to look at other avenues, then let's have conversations. So I think we're on time and at time. So just wanted to say a very massive thank you for choosing to come here and to be in this conversation and to engage.